Good morning. Lauda and I divided this talk. I'm setting the stage. She's giving you the data, then you'll see me again. This is a summary of the Local Food Safety Collaborative Needs Assessment Survey and listening sessions. If you were in morning session, you know that Chelsea mentioned this as one of the deliverables for the Local Food Safety Collaborative. So that's what we're going to give you a summary about. Just a little bit of background about this. She mentioned that they were focused on local producers. Okay, what's the definition of local? Yeah, it turns out there is not one. So what we did is we sort of took part of the produce safety rule and said, if you sell half your produce within 275 miles, we're going to call that what we're calling local. But I want to be clear about that because you could argue the definition of local for a very long time. So I think it's important to put context behind when we say local, what that means. We knew from the beginning we were going to do a survey and following it up with listening sessions. And again, you could argue this one way. Some people do listening sessions before they do surveys. Some people do surveys and then listening sessions. I see Lori nodding her head. So there's a number of ways to skin this cat. This is how we decided to do it. And again, we knew we were going to have to clarify things one way or the other. We focused on a national scope. Laura's going to show you data that shows what kind of coverage we got. We also were very sensitive to the 4 FDA regions. So we had one listening session in every FDA region. Does that mean our listening session data can be extrapolated to regional importance? I'm going to argue no, right? Each listening session had 7 to 15 people. I don't think that speaks to regionalness. I do think it speaks to differences you see with small groups of people, and we'll talk a little bit about those differences that we saw. I think that's important to, though, mention, because just because we had one in the Northeast region, I don't necessarily think it speaks to all the diversity in the Northeast region. Very, very important slide before I hand this over to her. We have 20 minutes to give you an overview of lots and lots of data. The reports are both here for you to look at and to review. We are working to get them peer reviewed and published so that they can have that citation that makes people more comfortable about citing the work. To what Hans was saying yesterday, you got to make sure you back up what you're saying with science, right? So we want to make sure we can get these peer reviewed. That is in process now. We're not exactly sure where they're going to go, but I'm in discussion with a couple of different journals. So with that, I'll let Lauda give you the data.
Thank you, Betsy, for that nice intro. Moving along, I will be talking about the density of the survey responses nationwide. So you can see on this map that the darker regions are the areas with the higher density of survey responses, with the lower regions being the light yellow. And this darker distribution is also correlated with the high production crop areas in the United States. I wanted to note that we had 1,273 survey responses nationwide, and we had 207 in the Northeast region. I blocked it off by state, and we had 8 participants in the grower listening session and 9 in the processor listening session. So these USDA identifiers are served to kind of gauge what kind of audience members took our survey. I do want to point out that the N in this column does not add up to 1,273 because many participants chose more than one box. They had more than one identifier associated with their farm. And we had a very similar distribution of these numbers in our Northeast listening sessions and survey responses. So total survey participants in national versus the Northeast, we had different identifiers for farmers who process, processors who farm, packers, aggregators, and this is the breakdown. I want to highlight that the national and the Northeast averages were pretty similar, the percentages, were pretty similar, and I do want to specify that the 3 highest percentages As many of you probably have experienced, lots of farmers also process or do other activities, and with the changing definition of a farm and multiple activities covered under the produce safety rule and the preventive controls for human foods rule, some of these growers might be subject to a multitude of regulations, and they might be feeling these sorts of pressures from regulations in more than one way. So for gross annual sales, we had the majority of our participants in the two lowest grossing brackets right here, and it's similar, a national average versus the Northeast percentages as well. This kind of echoes the needs that we saw in our listening sessions and in the surveys, kind of echoed that they were smaller, the smaller farms and operations. And as Meredith mentioned yesterday, these different size operations come with different deficiencies and also needs, and we were able to see that in our listening session and survey results. To come back to here really quickly. Yesterday in the work group in the work group discussion, there was a gentleman in the back, I don't remember who he was, but he did bring up the point about what is the best way of reaching farmers through our various networks. And I want to bring up the point that maybe with farmers identifying in more than one way, or having people that will fall under the rule that identify in maybe more than one way, we might need to kind of adjust the types of avenues that we're sending our educational materials or tailoring the educational materials to people who might be doing multiple activities on their operation. And then I covered this. And so every market is supplied by local food producers. This was something that came through in our survey data nationwide, and this is just a visual representation of the percentage of market sales in the Northeast region of the United States. So as you can see, each of these 8 bars represent one grower that attended the listening session. And each of these bars have a variety of different colors and color combinations and size of the bars. So this means that each of these growers, none of them look exactly the same. So no two growers have exactly the same market, but they are in a diversity of markets across the listening sessions and in the surveys. In the survey, the USDA Foods Commodity Program was not supplied, but family and friends was added as an other category that was not represented in this graphic. And I do want to specify that wholesale and export were not supplied in this specific graphic for this specific group of participants. So worker training, I know that it's been a big topic of discussion throughout this meeting, and as we discovered in our survey, it was also a potential topic of confusion. So there was a question in our survey that asked participants if food safety trainings are provided for all workers on their operation. And we got a surprisingly high number of results that said NA. So that could mean a variety of different things, but since this survey was just bubble in, we really didn't get any clarification from that survey. So we moved on to the listening sessions and we clarified what this NA in the worker training question could potentially mean. So in these, there's 3 main reasons that we kind of teased out in the listening sessions. And the first is that worker training, if not written down, if informal, might not be regarded as an official worker training. So when we were asking people what they did about their worker training or if they had any worker training programs, and this came out in the pre-listening session written surveys as well as the vocal listening sessions, that people would say that no, they don't have a worker training program. Then we keep asking questions, and it comes out that they do have worker training programs. They're just not written down. I have a quote later on where someone said, no, we don't have one. We've had these workers for 10 years and they already know what to do. So at one point a conversation was had, and it's probably had every year, depending on the operation, and it's not formal, not written down, but it is still some type of worker training. The other thing that we found, due to the small size of the operations in the Northeast, is that sometimes there's only 1 or 2 workers in the operations. So these 1 or 2 workers are normally co-owners. They won't be training each other. That just isn't something that would happen. And the third one, which came out very saliently in the Southern listening sessions, but also in the Northeastern due to the size. There's a lot of family, volunteers, and church members that might be participating as workers, although when asked, people don't consider them workers. They consider them friends, family, volunteers, but they don't fit that preconceived idea of what a worker is. So those people aren't being trained in the same way, maybe due to running the risk of insulting people, like, hey, you gotta wash your hands, and that could be perceived as like, oh, maybe you're dirty, or don't know how to wash your hands. So that, specifically that last bullet, provides an opportunity for educational materials as we further define what a worker is given the different contexts of these operations throughout the nation. And my last bullet here is, at the beginning of each listening session, we asked whether what kinds of food safety things or considerations were taken into account on people's operations. And not very often did worker training come up as something that's inherently food safety in the eyes of many producers. So that's something also that could be clarified, or moving forward could be tailored in education and outreach. I know it already is, but that might be a concept that isn't hitting home for people. So in the Northeast listening sessions, the diversity of operations did make it quite difficult for some growers to find assistance or templates or resources that fit their operation more exactly. I'll talk about this a little bit more in depth later on, but specifically in the Northeast, we had a variety of pretty complex or creative combination of operations that didn't lend themselves to the traditional templates or maybe resources that might already be out there. And the lack of consistent answers by their local authorities, or even just looking on the internet, was cited frequently as a concern. So technical assistance was repeatedly requested and specified as a need. This wasn't just in the Northeast, but it was consistently cited across listening sessions by multiple participants in many different ways. And specific names of people who were helpful were brought up. We got first and last names, organizations that they were a part of, how many years they were a helpful resource or trusted source of information for them. And these included extension associates, government personnel, organic inspectors. And this type of experience, the high level of competency, it's not easily replaced. It's not someone that you can just grab off the street. These people are trusted within these communities. It did come out a couple times. I remember specifically in the North Central region that some of these trusted people within their communities, trusted source of information, are nearing retirement age, and some of these growers and processors are kind of freaking out. They're like, we're going to be left by ourselves. Like, no one's going to be there to help us. So this just goes to show that these, the people who, the trainers, the people in food safety who who might be able to provide this type of technical assistance. They're not beginners. They're people who've been in the game for many, many years and have the flexibility and competency to answer these complicated questions for people. It was also noted that due to the small size of these operations, any amount of financial help could be incredibly beneficial and helpful, and the grant writing is a daunting process for a lot of people, and they wish that there was more assistance in that realm. As I stated before, there were very small farms with diverse operations, and again, as I said before, there's some unusual conditions in the Northeast listening session. There are a lot of contract growers or rooftop farms where the responsibility over training or who owns the crop at what given time was a topic of contention, and they were a bit confused about where they fell under each rule and at what process in their harvest or growing operation they stopped being responsible for certain responsibilities. And again, especially the smaller guys, they feel the local, state, by our federal requirements, the pressures of these different requirements a lot more than maybe some of the larger operations who might be able to afford consultants or someone to help them figure out where they stand. And there were a couple instances who also weren't able to expand their operation due to lack of technical assistance. There was a lack of clarity in the answers they were given in choosing infrastructure or growing up their operation due to this interpretation of the rule. In some cases, the resources that were requested throughout these listening sessions don't exist, but I was happy to see that a lot of them do exist, and the people just don't know where to look. I'll mention this in one of my summary slides coming up, but people were confused by the websites. There's a lot of different websites, and the ways they're set up are confusing to people, and they get bogged down by all the tabs or just going around in circles, emails, listservs, etc. So I have some notable quotes from producers in the Northeast that came out of both the processor and the grower listening sessions. So I'll read them one by one. I'm finding myself at the fringe of a lot of different subjects. There's a lot of ambiguity in the food safety standards. So we all know how ambiguous some of these rules really are under certain circumstances. And I do think that that could be stifling creativity and diversity and the ways that people innovate within the industry. You have to make time for this thing that you never had to make time for before. I'm sure you guys have heard this over and over. I know I don't have endless time, and I know they don't either. And time is money for everyone, but especially for these smaller growers. It's like a part-time job to work with Whole Foods. I don't know if it's worth it. So there's buyers. I know they're upstairs, but this is telling. Not all markets are really worth maintaining. In the state ones, you have the same inspectors for 3 years, and then they go on vacation, and a different inspector comes, and they want you to rip the place down and then build it up from the start so it meets there. And the guy got cut off, but you guys know. You know what he's trying to say. And they're just asking for consistency. It's not an unreasonable request. To me, it's like the government is funded to create all these regulations, and why aren't they also helping us follow the regulations? And we talked about this yesterday, and I think it might have come up earlier today, but there is that need for government to continue to fund outreach and education time and time again. The growers, the processors, they're all feeling it. And lastly, and yet the Food Safety Modernization Act has halted us from planned expansion because it's been very difficult for us to get a clear and definitive information about which local regulation we fall under. And this one, there's a lot to unpack there. But I think that people, part of it, they aren't getting straight answers, and that will impact the economic development in the region and for these growers, these small growers that are keystone in these smaller communities. But at the same time, I do think that people get confused about audits, inspections, FSMA, what is what, and whether local regulation has anything to do with that. So these next two slides are going to be summary slides, and they're just the key barriers in these listening sessions. Communication of appropriate, timely, clear information, and again, this inconsistency between the state, federal, and commercial requirements. With the confusing websites, this was found across the listening sessions, but it was reiterated in this one. Buyer pressures of requirements. They feel like it's one step ahead of where industry is. There was a grower where harmonized gap doesn't go where they are, and they took too long to get there and they lost the business. At the time, it's hard to find the time to do things, even if people are offering the help. So it just goes back to, I think Hans mentioned it yesterday, the things that we're asking these small growers to do are going to cost money, resources, time, and this all is a big burden on them. So it's all about trying to find solutions that limits or decreases the amount of added burden they have to deal with, while also complying. So the paperwork, and we've heard it, it's overwhelming volume and confusing and inconsistent requirements. All of these tie into one another. The labor with the language barriers, worker training, and it is good to see that some of these might have already been talked about in our work group session yesterday, and that we are aware of these needs and we're moving forward. So the cost for infrastructure, bathrooms, and hand washing stations were noted. The grant structure being inconsistent and not enough funding being available for growers and processors. They were discouraged from writing grants because there's so few that they feel like they're competing against their neighbor. And processors felt that growers had more funding sources than were available to them. And understanding the regulation, there's ambiguity and they're unaware of a requirement until it's a problem at the inspection or at the audit. And they have difficulty applying this regulation within their own operations. So this is where technical assistance comes into place. And lastly, but not least, the culture, the changing culture of farming. It was mentioned that some of these newer guys maybe have a leg up because they're going in with food safety on the brain. They already know, or they're changing the way that they're thinking about things. And the mindset is going to be different. So that is it for my summary, and I will hand it off to Betsy.
Thanks. Yeah. I just want to wrap up by giving you a few things to ponder. I know, we're over. We're not over, but we're trying to compress. Some producers are more FSMA ready. I do want to leave you with this hopeful note. The growers that attended these listening sessions, it's not all dour. Lots of them are moving in the right direction. They're putting practices into place. Depending on where they're at, they are actually more prepared for compliance with the rule than they think. So depending on where they were, it turns out organic farmers, because of the requirement for record keeping, they are like up, they're ready, they're going. So I don't want to leave it with the dour state of we're not prepared, but I think there are some real needs. And this need for a technical assistance is so abundantly clear, it's amazing. But the key is they need good technical assistance. We all laugh, but there are a lot of details to this thing. And they do know the people who give them good information. And they smell a rat when they smell one, right? And they go back to these people. And the issue Laura mentioned about they are one of the people's close to retirement, there was a lot of discussion and panic in that because she's retiring and they're going to lose her, right? The other thing is, though, is here's the empowering thing. If you do a good job, these guys know their stuff when you ask them food safety questions in the Northeast. The person they're interacting with is very good. They know the answer to food safety questions because they've had a good interaction with somebody who's competent. So I cannot stress that enough. Inconsistent information and lack of information, which are actually two different things, are killing us. It's killing the growers in the sense of they don't know what to do, so they don't do anything, which is dangerous, or they make up what they're supposed to do, also dangerous. And it causes unreasonable disruptions to their production. And we need to think about this. And this is really a call to some of our government organizations to get off the pot and get these answers out there. It is really stalling the implementation. And there is a lot of issue with, if you lose them midstream, they think food safety is witchcraft and not science, right? They think these requirements aren't actually based on science. They're based on something random. And when that happens, we all lose. And that's a problem. And much work is left to do. There's a ton of information they need. Sometimes it's clarification. One of the things Laura was, I want to clarify when she was talking about it is there's lots of information, but these guys want it tailored to their exact operation. And as she showed you in that graph, none of their operations are alike. So we at least need to get close to what they're doing and have those discussions with them. If you're working with local guys, think about those needs because they're very specific. I'll give you an example. We talked yesterday about the worker training fact sheet. Nowhere on there did we have a discussion about how do you talk to your church group that's coming out to harvest, right? And for some people, this is a real big issue. So I will leave you with that, and thank you for your time.
Any clarifying questions for Betsy or Laura? Okay, we'll move right into the next presentation from Hannah Doyle. Hannah is a farmer from Bakersfield, Vermont, where she and her husband John and son Reuben run Boneyard Farm. And Hannah's also kind enough to find time in her busy life to work on some special projects for NECAFs, and delighted to have her as part of the team and have her introduce the work.
Yes, thank you, Chris. So yeah, I'm a farm-at-home mom. I have a small background in some research and outreach for UVM Extension, but I have more of a background as a grower coming up with food safety protocols and manuals, training employees, that kind of thing. So I was thrilled when Chris and Elizabeth asked me to help out with this because it's pretty new to be on this side of food safety. And I think this project in particular allowed me to bring sort of a fresh set of eyes to this project. So just to orient you to the larger context, we were talking about this yesterday, but the systematic review was developed, I think, as a response to these conferences and a need for this. We've said, look, there's all these needs reviews out there. Let's compile them and see what we've learned from them rather than duplicating the work. So you might guess, I chose the green card yesterday when we talked about what NECAFs does. I don't want to duplicate all the work that's been done. We want to pull it together and move forward from it. So the systematic review aims to provide a complete, exhaustive summary of current literature and needs assessments, published and unpublished. We'll talk about it, but for now, we're just including published, of growers. And originally, we had intended to include processors in this scope, but we decided to just focus on producers here in the Northeast region. So some of these papers are national as well, but we've included them because they're really relevant and we can learn from the needs assessments that have been done nationwide. So the first step here was to see what's out there and then to report back, and that's in the form of the literature review that I wrote last winter. Then Chris and Elizabeth added to it, gave me feedback. Then we had a working group call in late April of last year with a lot of the experts who are here in the room. What did you think of what we found? Is it missing anything? And then in the meantime, there was a USDA report released and the great work that Betsy and Laura have done with the Local Food Safety Collaborative. So I added that information, revised it slightly, and then sent a PDF to you all. So you've all read it, I'm sure. And so right now we're at the process of presenting it to you, kind of ground truthing what we've found, and then we're hoping to revise it and publish the work. And then the next steps might be considering some unpublished needs assessments that are maybe ongoing now, or just, the sort of gray papers, as we say. And most importantly, though, making recommendations for outreach. So what can we learn from all this and actually have an impact? So I'll go through the methods of the lit review kind of quickly, but if you have questions about methodologies, we can talk about it or find me later. Our research question, step 1, come up with a research question. What are the known needs identified through assessment when looking specifically at produce safety among small, medium-sized producers in the US? So this is formal assessments, not guesses or anecdotal evidence. What has been done already, and what does it tell us? So to do this, I knew I needed to keep a very meticulous search log with keywords and how I found the papers. So I'd kept track of which database I used to find it, the date I found it. I established a date range, although we didn't set really concrete parameters on it. I found that most things that were pre-GAP were not actually very helpful or relevant anymore anyway. So the oldest paper in the lit review is 2002. So we kind of have the last 2 decades of research. And I started by developing these search terms. And you don't have to read all of these. They're not, it doesn't matter too much, just to know that by sort of cross-referencing, I'd put in PSA and education and produce grower and food safety and kind of see what came back. So I'm narrowing the search to find surveys and evaluations and interviews that are actually done with produce growers in the Northeast, in specific states, nationwide, but something that's relevant to our research. So there are 35 papers included in the lit review. Most of them, the majority of them, I guess, came from food protection trends. There are 8 papers there, 7 papers in food control. 5 of the papers are government or university reports, so they're not peer-reviewed, published reports in that same way, but they're USDA reports or Cornell University reports. And then there are some Journal of Extension, Hort Technology, Renewable Ag and Food Systems, some more obscure publications there. So the first thing I found was that needs assessments can be conducted in a lot of different ways. There are surveys that either got mailed or emailed to growers. There are phone interviews. I really like the term listening sessions. That didn't come up in my research until you guys, but basically interviews with growers. And then these pre and post evaluations or tests. And mostly this is growers self-reporting what their needs are, and that's what we really wanted to hear. But it's also sort of important to note that that's growers reporting what their hurdles or barriers to compliance are, but it's not necessarily what the gaps in practice actually are. So what emerged from all this was a way to think about these needs assessments that, that's, I can be loud. Oh, can you hear me? No. Yes? Okay, I'll be loud. So we think about this work in terms of 2 frameworks. So in the center we have needs. What are the barriers to compliance, or what are the growers reporting back as needs? And we've come up with these sort of umbrella concepts just as a way of thinking about it. So training, knowledge, time, capital, and mindset. And we'll get a little bit deeper into all of those. But I think as we go through, I've been really glad to speak at the second day of this conference because I've been listening with a very careful ear to what people are reporting back, and I'm thinking like, okay, yeah, that fits in capital, that fits in knowledge. Yeah, okay, that works with the framework that we came up with. So I think most of the needs that we can think about fit somewhere into these umbrella terms. So in the center of this excellent graphic that Chris came up with, we have our needs and barriers. And then outside them is sort of all of the factors that change for each individual grower what their needs are. So the size of your farm might affect how much knowledge you need or how much capital you need. And a lot of the reports that people are presenting are grouped by annual sales or by organic versus conventional. So that is all sort of validating for me to see anyway. Oh, there we go. So let's see. So we'll get into the needs a little bit. And as I said, it's nice to be here on the second day. One, because I've never met a lot of you. It's nice to see some friendly faces now after getting to know you. And also just in the purpose of ground truthing these frameworks, it's been good to see what you are all finding out there. So probably the one that's most often assumed is that there's a knowledge deficit. That's the easiest one to present to growers also. So we assume that if a practice isn't being done on a farm, it's because the farmer doesn't know to do it, maybe. And we can kind of dive deeper on knowledge models and cognition versus intention and all of that stuff, which is in a lot of these papers. But it's definitely a need for growers. And as Laura said, technical assistance is high on the list for a lot of growers. One thing that came up over and over is confusion about specific regulations. So am I covered? Am I exempt? What do I actually need to do with my ag water? That kind of thing. And then what are the best practices that extension is, or that outreach professionals in general are recommending? What do we do here? And again, a consistent message would be great there. And the growers want to know the science behind recommendations also. So why is my water being contaminated by this pathogen? How does it actually work? So there's a lot to put out there in terms of knowledge. But again, just a note that knowledge gain does not always lead to behavioral change. And Keith Schneider talked about that this morning. So another thing that came up over and over was training, and that could be for the actual farm owner or for her employees, technical skills, orientation to the rules and applications of these best practices. So okay, this is the best practice. How do we actually do it on our farm? Can you come to our farm and show us what that might mean on the ground? And then worker training came up again and again. Another thing, obviously, capital. How are we going to make this happen? There's a high cost of compliance, and we'll talk about it, but a different cost of compliance for different farms, of course. So actual cash money is one of them, but also under capital, I'm including things like infrastructure. Where do we find those rinse washers? And how do we get the knives that are easily sanitized? And so sourcing that, and how much is it going to cost me to ship it across the country if there's only one manufacturer? All of that is part of capital in my mind. And there's also this cost of labor. So the next one, you've all worked with growers. You know that time is a huge limiting factor for people. They often report back that they don't have enough time to write a written food safety protocol or to train their workers or to do the deep cleans of those post-harvest equipment that they should be doing. And so this includes the day-to-day work of food safety, but it also includes, we just don't have enough help on the ground, or the deadlines are coming up too quickly. So that all sort of fits under time. And then I think this one is maybe the most interesting. We struggled with what to call it as we were writing this literature review. We thought about attitude for a while, or perception, or confidence, but I really think that it sort of encapsulates all of that. So we decided to call it mindset. And we've been talking about this a lot for the last 2 days, I think. Why are growers going to make this change? What's the incentive? Is it fear of punishment or a potential upside to enacting these changes? And if outreach professionals can provide some big picture motivation for food safety, I think that will help a lot. And also we talk about prioritization. So if your lettuce is overrun by Galansoga, but you're also supposed to deep clean your barrel washer, how do we convey to people the urgency of the food safety protocols that we're trying to push on them? And then the confidence to get it done. And I think that comes from the trust that you get with working one-on-one with people who are coming out to your farm to help. But I mean, I think really when we're talking about this, we should really be thinking about mindset. And Kevin Cody mentioned yesterday in his work with new and beginning farmers, step one is always, why does it matter? Why are we doing this? And I think that's really important to sort of zoom out and think, because we are also engrossed in this every day, that I think that message can sometimes fall through the cracks. So here we're going to talk about the factors that influence need a little bit more. And it's interesting because a lot of these papers are organized by these factors. So, by region or by size or by type or by market, sometimes we're looking at this data in that way. But it's also important to think that for all of these different categories or contexts, you can say that the practices on a farm vary by size or they vary by type. So of course their needs vary by those factors as well. So it's important to consider. So region, we've talked about how, a grower in northern Maine is going to be different in terms of their practices than a grower in Southern California, for example. But also the public perceptions of food safety vary from region to region. So there are different ideas about food production and how safe buying local is and all of that from state to state and region to region. And that was interesting to see. And then there are cultural differences among producers as well. So we've talked about language and literacy, but also culturally appropriate outreach. And as Josiah said, context matters in all of this. And we need to think about who might be being left out of the conversation and how we can be sensitive to different regions and cultural differences. So also farm size. The annual sales of a farm obviously impact their need to comply and their coverage for FSMA's produce safety rule, but also, they might, at a larger scale, they might be more set up to take on some of these best management practices. And an example there is that the cost of compliance for these farms at different sizes is widely different. Farm type, as Betsy mentioned, a lot of the organic growers are already pretty well set because they've been record keeping and doing this kind of work for a while. The conventional growers might have a bigger burden of compliance or a bigger gap there to meet compliance. And growers vary in terms of what they grow. So a romaine lettuce grower might have different needs than a green bean producer, or a very small, very diverse farm in Bakersfield, Vermont is going to be different than someone who's got a mechanical carrot harvester somewhere. And then lastly, the market. A lot of buyer requirements have already put some of these best management practices in place. So who you're selling your produce to changes what you have, how far you have to get there already. So the burden of compliance is different for different growers. It's disproportional. We need to meet each farmer where she's at and be sensitive to the influencing factors that make a difference. So I'm just going to show this slide one more time. I don't know how we're doing on time, but we're going to sort of take some time to talk about this with you guys. This is the most important part of the work we're presenting here today. what we want to do is think about how we can meet our stakeholders' needs in the best way possible. So how can we meet those 5 needs while being sensitive to those 4 factors that impact them? And we've talked about this a bit too, but we need to consider the source of the delivery. Over and over again, respondents said that, there's a difference in who is presenting the information, how consistent it is, how experienced those people are, how credible they are. And that consistency of messaging was very important. And then also the method of delivery. So a lot of these needs assessments ask a question about how would you like to receive outreach materials. And it's different for different regions. It's different for different types. It's different depending on these influencing factors. So there's something to consider in literacy and language barriers. And, we might have to think outside the box in terms of creative solutions to the problems that growers are bringing. So the future of this project is hopefully, like I said, submitting it for publication, probably in the Journal of Extension, as we've talked about, but we'll see. And including some unpublished needs assessments, and also including the feedback that we get from today's session. So we're really looking forward to hearing from you. Does this framework make sense? Is there something that I totally overlooked? Does the literature review match what you are seeing on the ground? And most importantly, how can we use this work to actually help growers who are trying to comply with food safety regulations? Good.
That's great. Thanks, Hannah.